Back off right now. You are not coming near her.
The dinner rush was at its peak when the young waitress moved through the golden-lit aisles of the restaurant. Petite in her red vest, her white shirt crisp, but her movements were heavy with the exhaustion of a double shift. She stopped at table 4. She stopped in front of him. The man every powerful socialite in the city pretended not to see, yet feared with every breath. The man the underworld called the ghost of soul. The man whose name was a death sentence whispered in dark alleys. Park Sung-hoon. He was adjusting his tailored black coat when the air in the room suddenly shattered. A sharp, stinging crack echoed against the marble walls, the sound of a hand hitting skin. The billionaire at table 6 stood over her, his face twisted with arrogant disdain, while the young waitress clutched her red, stinging cheek, eyes glossy with shock and trauma. Sung-hoon's entire crew, seated at the surrounding tables, froze. The restaurant's security guards swallowed hard, their hands trembling. Even the piano player seemed to stop mid-chord. No one ever raised a hand in Sung-hoon's presence. People came to him to beg for their lives or negotiate blood debts, but no one ever dared to bring violence to his table. He stood up slowly, his jaw clenched, his veins pulsing with an explosive, silent rage. Amara. His voice was a low, lethal vibration. Why did he touch you? The girl hesitated, leaning instinctively toward him, her small frame seeking the only safety she had ever known in this cold city. She pointed a trembling finger at the rich man, who still stood with his hand raised, realizing too late the catastrophic shadow now looming over him. Sung-hoon's pulse ticked once, sharp. He recognized that face, a man who thought his bank account made him a god, a man who treated the lowly as disposable. What the Mafia boss did next in that crowded 5-star restaurant, drawing his weapon to shield a girl the world considered invisible, shook the city's elite to their core and started a war that would burn the establishment to the ground. Stay with me until the end, because the truth of why this lethal predator calls a humble waitress his only friend will leave you speechless. Please subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories. Amara Johnson moved through the golden-lit aisles of the Gilded Plate with a grace that masked the dull ache in her lower back. Her red vest was buttoned tight, her white shirt crisp, but the weight of a double shift hung heavy on her small frame. In a place where the wine bottles cost more than her monthly rent, Amara had perfected the art of being invisible. She was a shadow in a red vest, a ghost moving between mahogany tables, serving the city's elite who looked through her as if she were made of glass. To them, she wasn't a young woman supporting a family. She was a service utility, a hand to pour water and a back to carry their silver trays. The restaurant was a cathedral of arrogance, filled with the clinking of fine china and the low hum of deals being made by men who never knew the taste of struggle. But every evening, at exactly 6:30 p.m., the atmosphere near the back corner changed. Amara always handled table 4 personally. She didn't need to be told. It was an unspoken arrangement that had lasted for months. Seated there was Park Sung-hoon, a man whose presence felt like a cold blade resting on the table. He was middle-aged, his hair dark and perfectly controlled, matching the sharp, disciplined lines of his expensive black suit. Every other server at the restaurant avoided table 4. They whispered about the men in black sedans who waited outside, and the way the room seemed to lose its warmth whenever Sung-hoon walked in. They saw a monster, a man with hardened facial features whose very name was a death sentence whispered in the city's dark alleys. But Amara saw something else. She remembered a rainy Tuesday a year ago when the restaurant was nearly empty and Sung-hoon had arrived looking weary, his eyes carrying a weight she recognized from her own father's face. She hadn't hovered or performed the fake bubbly persona the manager demanded. She had simply brought him a glass of water and a warm towel, acknowledging his presence with a quiet, genuine nod of respect. Since then, a secret, respectful bond had formed in the silence between them. He never spoke much, and she never asked for more than his order, but the communication was there. When she approached table 4 today, she didn't see the ghost of soul that the newspapers feared. She saw the only customer who ever looked her in the eye when she spoke. As she refilled his water, Sang-hoon's lethal focus softened for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of her hard work. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly from carrying the heavy trays, and she noticed the way he sat with his back to the wall, a predator who was always on guard. In this high-end temple of vanity, they were two outsiders who recognized each other's armor. Amara didn't know the extent of the blood on his hands, and Sang-hoon didn't know the details of the bills piling up on her kitchen table, but they shared the same language of survival. To the rest of the world, she was just an invisible girl in a red vest, but at table 4, she was a person. She turned away to attend to a louder, flashier group at table 6, unaware that the quiet respect of the man behind her was the only thing standing between her and a storm she couldn't possibly survive. The shift in the room began not with a shout, but with the grating sound of a heavy chair being shoved back across the marble floor at table 6. Amara had been moving with her usual quiet efficiency, balancing a tray of crystal glassware, when the billionaire, a man whose name was synonymous with old money and new arrogance, let out a sharp, guttural sound of disgust. A small splash of vintage red wine had landed on his silk tie, a microscopic accident caused by his own erratic gesturing. Amara had stepped forward immediately, her voice soft and apologetic, reaching for a linen napkin to remedy the situation. But the man didn't want an apology, he wanted a target. The violence was sudden and discordant, shattering the sophisticated hum of the dining room. With a speed that betrayed his age, the man lunged forward and delivered a stinging, open-handed slap across Amara's face. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing off the high ceilings and gilded mirrors of the restaurant. Amara's head snapped to the side, her small frame staggering back as the tray of glasses slipped from her hands, crashing into 1,000 shimmering shards on the floor. She clutched her cheek, which was already blooming into a vivid, angry red, her eyes wide and glossy with a mixture of shock and profound trauma. The billionaire stood over her, his face twisted in a mask of entitlement, his chest heaving as he began to spew a vitriolic stream of insults, calling her incompetent and invisible. Then came the silence. It wasn't the natural quiet of a room catching its breath. It was a vacuum of sound, heavy and terrifying, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the restaurant. Every patron at the surrounding tables froze mid-gesture. The server, who had been decrumbing a nearby table, stood paralyzed, his eyes darting toward the back corner of the room. The rich customer, still panting from his outburst, felt the sudden drop in temperature before he saw the cause. He turned his head slowly, his arrogance beginning to flicker like a dying candle as he realized that the entire room wasn't looking at him. They were looking at the man at table 4. Park Sung-hoon had risen from his seat with a predatory stillness that made the billionaire's explosive anger look like child's play. The Mafia boss stood with his jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck were visible, his dark, neatly styled hair casting a shadow over eyes that had turned into chips of black ice. He didn't shout and he didn't rush. He stepped into the light, his black tailored coat signaling a level of danger that the man from table 6 was only just beginning to comprehend. The restaurant's security guards, men who were usually quick to handle any disturbance, remained rooted to the spot, their faces pale, as they recognized the disciplined, high-status presence of a man whose name they only dared to whisper. The ghost of Soul moved toward the wreckage of the glassware, his lethal focus locked entirely on the antagonist, who now appeared smaller and weaker, his hands raised instinctively in a gesture of uncertain defense. Sung-hoon reached out, not to strike, but to firmly wrap his arm around Amara's trembling shoulders, pulling her instinctively into a protective embrace. She leaned into him, her body tense and shoulders drawn in, seeking the only shield that mattered in a room full of people who had watched her be struck and done nothing. The Mafia boss's other hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, as he looked the rich man in the eyes with a gaze that conveyed a singular, terrifying truth. A catastrophic mistake had been made, and the price would be paid in blood. The silence in the restaurant was no longer empty. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of spilled wine and the sudden metallic tang of fear. Park Sung-hoon did not look at the crowd, nor did he acknowledge the manager who stood trembling by the kitchen doors. His world had narrowed to the petite woman shivering beside him. With a fluid, practiced motion, he unbuttoned his black tailored coat, a garment that signaled wealth and lethal authority to everyone in the room, and draped it over Amara's shoulders. The heavy wool swallowed her small frame, the warmth of his body heat acting as a temporary barrier against the trauma that had just shattered her evening. She clutched the lapels with trembling fingers, her eyes wide and glossy as she leaned into him, her body language signaling a deep, instinctive emotional dependence on the only man who had stood up for her. The rich customer at table 6 tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the words died in his throat when Sung-hoon finally turned his head. The Mafia boss's jaw was clenched tight, his sharp, hardened features locked in a mask of explosive rage that promised a violence far worse than a simple slap. He didn't need to shout. His disciplined, high-status presence did the talking for him. He reached out and gripped his handgun firmly, the metal glinting under the golden chandeliers as he extended his arm in a posture that was both protective and terrifyingly aggressive. The antagonist froze mid-movement, his hands raised as the realization of his catastrophic mistake finally took hold. He looked smaller now, a weak and uncertain figure compared to the lethal focus of the man standing before him. Sung-hoon's other arm wrapped tightly around Amara, shielding her from the prying eyes of the elite diners who had watched her humiliation in silence. He began to move, guiding her toward the exit with a steady, unbreakable pace. Every step they took across the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat in the hallowed silence of the restaurant. As they passed the security team, the guards looked at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the ghost of Soul. They knew that by the time the sun rose, the power balance of the city would be irrevocably changed. Amara kept her face pressed against the dark fabric of Sung-hoon's coat, the red slap mark on her cheek a vivid reminder of the cruelty she had endured, but for the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of safety. They reached the heavy oak doors, and Sung-hoon paused for only a second. He didn't look back at the billionaire, but his voice carried through the room with a chilling clarity. It was a promise of ruin, a declaration that the invisible waitress was actually the only friend of a man who never forgot a debt and never forgave a strike. When they stepped out into the cool night air, the black sedans of his crew were already idling at the curb, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. He handed Amara into the back of his own car, his loyalty to her absolute and unquestioned, leaving the restaurant behind in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. The war for Amara's dignity had begun, and the city's elite had no idea how much they were about to lose. Within the silent, leather-bound interior of the black sedan, Park Sung-hoon watched the city lights blur into streaks of cold neon, his arm still wrapped firmly around a trembling Amara. He did not need to raise his voice to command the destruction of a man. He only needed to exist with the lethal focus that had made him the most feared name in the underworld. He pulled out an encrypted phone, his jaw still clenched with the explosive rage of a protector whose only friend had been violated in broad daylight. With a single short vibration of the line, his primary lieutenant, Luca, answered. There were no pleasantries, only the cold, calculated directives of a man who was about to reshape the balance of power in the city. Song-hoon's orders were precise. He wanted the rich man at table 6 stripped of everything that gave him the illusion of godhood. The mobilization began with the digital precision of a surgical strike. While Amara clutched the heavy lapels of Song-hoon's tailored black coat, seeking safety in the scent of his expensive cologne and the steady beat of his heart, the Mafia's financial wing began to move. By the time the sedan reached the safe house, the antagonist's primary offshore accounts had been flagged for suspicious activity by banks that were secretly under the ghost's payroll. It was a systematic dismantling of a life built on the exploitation of others. Song-hoon watched the updates flicker across his screen, his sharp, hardened features illuminated by the blue light of the phone. He didn't just want the man's money, he wanted the man to understand that without his wealth, he was smaller and weaker than the woman he had dared to strike. By midnight, the pressure transitioned from the digital to the physical world. Song-hoon's lieutenants, men with disciplined, high-status presences that mirrored their boss's authority, began making visits to the commercial landlords and board members who held the rich man's contracts. In the gilded offices of the city's elite, the message was delivered with chilling clarity. Doing business with the man from table 6 meant doing business against Park Song-hoon. One by one, the pillars of the antagonist's empire began to crumble. Loans were called in early, supply chains were mysteriously diverted, and the political influence the man relied on evaporated as the city's power players realized the ghost had chosen a side. As the sun began to peak over the harbor, the final phase of the operation targeted the man's most precious asset, his reputation. Song-hoon sat by Amara's side, ensuring she had warm tea and a place where she could finally let her wide, glossy eyes close in sleep. While she rested, a dossier of the man's darkest secrets, tax evasion, offshore bribery, and a history of mistreating staff was leaked to the very newspapers that usually protected his image. The man who had stood over Amara with a face twisted in arrogant disdain was now the target of a citywide scandal. Song-hoon looked at Amara's bruised cheek, his eyes locked forward with lethal focus. He was buying the world piece by piece, not for profit, but to ensure that by the time the antagonist realized his catastrophic mistake, there would be nothing left of his life but the memory of a waitress he should have never touched.
The safe house was quiet. The only sound, the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that mirrored the steady, lethal pulse of Park Sung-hoon as he watched Amara sleep. In the stillness of the dawn, his mind drifted back 3 years, to a night when he was not the ghost of Seoul with a fleet of black sedans, but a nameless, bleeding shadow in a rain-slicked alleyway. He had been ambushed by a rival faction, a rare moment of vulnerability that had left him with a jagged wound in his side and a vision blurred by his own blood. He had dragged himself toward the rear entrance of a modest 24-hour diner, his tailored coat shredded and his sharp, hardened features pale with the onset of shock. He remembered watching the feet of passers-by through the grimy window of the alley door. People had looked. They had seen the dark pool forming beneath him and the expensive, blood-soaked fabric of his suit, and they had turned away, their faces masks of indifference or fear. To them, he was a dangerous omen, a mistake they didn't want to survive.
But then the door had creaked open. Amara had stepped out to dump a bucket of soapy water, her red waitress vest already a familiar part of her identity even back then. She hadn't screamed, and she hadn't reached for a phone to call the police, who whispered his name in terror. Instead, her eyes, wide and glossy with a compassionate shock, had locked onto his. She had seen a man, not a monster. Without a word, she had dropped the bucket and knelt in the dirty rainwater, her petite frame straining as she helped him sit upright against the brick wall. While the rest of the city treated him as a ghost, she had treated him as a person. She had disappeared inside for a moment, returning with a clean white shirt and a first aid kit she had bought with her own meager tips. Her hands had trembled then, much as they did now, but her resolve had been absolute as she pressed the fabric against the deep injury in his side. She didn't ask who had hunted him or what kind of violence he had committed to earn such a wound. She simply stayed with him in the cold, her body language tense but protective, until the bleeding slowed and his strength returned. "You should go before they come back," she had whispered, her face showing the same vulnerability and courage that defined her today. She had refused the gold watch he tried to offer as payment, shaking her head as she leaned into the doorway, signaling that her help wasn't for sale. She had given him her only friend, a moment of genuine, selfless humanity in a world of calculated violence. As Seung-hoon sat in the safe house, his jaw clenched and his eyes locked forward with lethal focus, he realized that the debt he owed her was priceless. He had spent years building an empire of power and danger, but it was all worthless if it couldn't shield the one person who hadn't turned away when he was the one bleeding in the dark. The slap she had received at the restaurant was a debt he would repay by burning down the world of the man who gave it, for Amara was the only heart left in his cold, disciplined world. The golden morning light filtering through the safe house windows did not bring peace to Park Sung-hoon. It only illuminated the lethal focus in his eyes as he watched over Amara. While she slept, her petite frame still wrapped in the heavy, protective wool of his black tailored coat, the city outside was beginning to groan under the weight of his systematic dismantling of the antagonist. 2 miles away, in a penthouse that was rapidly becoming a cage, the rich customer stared at his tablet with a face that was tense and uncertain, his hands trembling as he refreshed his freezing bank accounts. He had spent the night realizing the catastrophic mistake he had made at the restaurant. He now knew the name of the man who had stood over him with a clenched jaw and visible veins of explosive rage, the man whose name was only whispered by the police who usually protected men like him. The billionaire was a man who had never lost, and his desperation was turning into a jagged, dangerous edge. He understood that he could not win a direct war against the ghost of Seoul, but he still believed that every person had a price or a pressure point. He appeared smaller and weaker in his disheveled suit than he had at the restaurant, but his arrogance remained a poisonous remnant. He reached for a secondary burner phone, bypassing the frozen corporate accounts to tap into a hidden reserve of cash he kept for untraceable services. He didn't want to strike back at Sung-hoon directly. He was a coward who preferred to target the vulnerable. He wanted to hurt the waitress who had ruined him, and he knew to hurt a woman like Amara, you didn't go for her, you went for the people she worked 3 jobs to protect. By noon, a black SUV that didn't belong to Sung-hoon's fleet was idling at the corner of the block where Amara's mother and younger sister lived. The antagonist had hired a crew of low-level street thugs, men who operated outside the disciplined, high-status presence of the organized Mafia, hoping their lack of direct connection to him would provide a shield. The rich man's instructions were simple and cruel: bring the family to his estate. He intended to use them as a bargaining chip, a way to force the Mafia boss into a stalemate. He sat in his office, his posture frozen mid-movement as he waited for the call, failing to realize that Sung-hun's loyalty to Amara was absolute, and his eyes were locked forward on every move his enemies made. Back at the safe house, Sung-hun's encrypted phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security detail he had quietly placed on Amara's family months before, long before the slap at the restaurant. His jaw tightened, and a sharp, hardened feature of his face twitched with a lethal intent. He looked at Amara, who was waking up, her eyes wide and glossy with a lingering shock as she clutched his coat. He didn't tell her about the SUV or the thugs. Instead, he knelt before her, his posture protective yet aggressive, his hand gripping her small one to signal safety. "Stay here, Piccolina," he whispered, using the term of endearment he reserved only for her. He stood up slowly, his hair neatly styled, and his dark eyes burning with the lethal focus of a man about to end war. The elite thought they could strike at his only friend's heart, but they were about to learn that crossing Park Sung-hun was a fatal mistake from which there was no recovery. The shadow of the black SUV stretched across the cracked pavement of the neighborhood where Amara's family lived, its tinted windows hiding the predatory intent of the mercenaries within. These were men hired by the rich customer to strike at the only thing Amara held dear. But as they opened their doors to begin their grim task, they found the street was no longer empty. News of the slap at the restaurant and the ghost's intervention had moved through the city's service industry like a silent electric current. The invisible people, the dishwashers, the janitors, the busboys, and the fellow waitresses in their red vests had spent their lives being stepped on by men in expensive suits. But today, they chose to stand up. It began with a single delivery driver parking his bike across the center of the road, blocking the SUV's path. Then came the local baker and the laundromat staff, their faces set with a grim determination that mirrored Park Sung-hun's own disciplined, high-status presence. One by one, they stepped out from their storefronts, forming a literal human wall between the mercenaries and the building where Amara's mother and sister were hiding. They didn't carry weapons, but they carried a collective rage that was just as lethal. They had seen the fresh injury on Amara's cheek through the social media whispers and the kitchen gossip, and they had seen how the most dangerous man in the city had knelt to protect her. If a Mafia boss could show such absolute loyalty to one of their own, then they could find the courage to do the same. The lead mercenary, a man with a hardened face who thought this would be a simple snatch and grab, stepped forward with a hand on his holster. He expected these people to scatter like pigeons, but the wall held firm. A young man in a stained apron stepped to the front, his shoulders drawn in not with fear, but with a protective aggression that signaled a fatal mistake was being made by the intruders. "You aren't going in there," he said, his voice a low, steady vibration that echoed the cold authority of Sung-hun. The street dogs seemed to stop barking, and the neighborhood fell into a heavy, terrifying silence as more service workers materialized from the alleyways, their eyes wide and glossy with a newfound sense of power. Behind the tinted glass of the SUV, the mercenaries hesitated. They were used to fighting rival gangs or intimidated witnesses, but they didn't know how to fight a community that had decided it was finished with being invisible. They looked at the faces of the people they usually ignored, the petite women and the tired men, and realized they were looking into the eyes of 1,000 only friends who were all under the protection of the ghost of soul. The rich customer's money couldn't buy a way through a wall built on genuine emotional dependence and shared trauma. High above the street, Park Sung-hun watched the scene unfold through a long-range surveillance feed, his jaw clenched and his hand gripping his handgun firmly. He saw his own explosive rage reflected in the faces of the neighbors, and for the first time in his life of calculated violence, he felt a different kind of pride. He had intended to burn the city down to save Amara, but he realized that her courage had already ignited a fire in the hearts of those around her. He signaled his lieutenants to hold back their intervention for just a moment longer. He wanted the elite to see that their power meant nothing when the innocent decided to stand their ground. The human wall was unbreakable, and as the mercenaries began to retreat in a state of uncertain panic, the message was sent loud and clear. Amara Johnson was no longer just a waitress, she was the heart of a neighborhood that would never be silenced again. The rich customer sat in the dim light of his sprawling study, the air thick with the scent of expensive scotch and the copper tang of fear. His posture was frozen mid-movement, his hand slightly raised as if he could ward off the inevitable shadow that had finally breached his sanctuary. He appeared smaller and weaker than he had when he delivered that arrogant slap at the restaurant. Now his face was a mask of uncertainty and growing dread. The door did not burst open. It swung wide with a terrifying, silent grace, revealing Park Seung-hoon. The Mafia boss stood in the threshold, his dark hair neatly styled, and his black tailored suit signaling a level of danger that the man in the chair had only ever read about in newspapers. His jaw was clenched tight, and the veins in his neck were visible, showing an explosive rage that he kept behind a thin veil of discipline. Seung-hoon stepped into the room with a predatory stillness, his eyes locked forward with a lethal focus that made the billionaire's lungs seize. He didn't come alone. Tucked under his arm, shielded by his massive frame, was Amara. She still wore her red waitress vest, her eyes wide and glossy with the trauma of the past 24 hours. But as she looked at the man who had hurt her, she didn't look away. She leaned into Seung-hoon instinctively, her body language tense, but drawing strength from the man who had turned the city upside down for her sake. Seung-hoon's arm wrapped tightly around her, showing that his loyalty to this petite woman was absolute, and his protection was a physical barrier no amount of money could buy. "You thought you were striking a waitress," Seung-hoon said, his voice a low, steady vibration that filled the room like a coming storm. "You thought you were hitting someone who didn't exist." He gripped his handgun firmly with one hand, the arm extended with a lethal precision that signaled a fatal mistake had been made by the man in the chair. The antagonist swallowed hard, his face tense as he realized that the ghost of soul wasn't there for a negotiation or a payout. He was there to settle a debt of blood and dignity. The rich man's hands trembled, his posture visually reinforcing the power imbalance between an entitled bully and a man who lived by a code of calculated violence. Amara looked at the red slap mark still visible on her cheek in the reflection of the study's polished glass, and then she looked at Seung-hoon. The Mafia boss knelt slightly, his posture protective yet aggressive, his eyes never leaving the target. He wasn't just a monster, he was a shield. The rich man began to stammer, offering apologies and millions of dollars, but the words were hollow. Seung-hoon stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the billionaire entirely. He forced the man to look at Amara, really look at her, and acknowledge the humanity he had tried to crush. The predatory stillness of the Mafia boss was the last thing the antagonist felt as the weight of his actions finally collapsed upon him. In that silent room, the price of a hand raised in cruelty was finally set, and the ghost of soul made sure the cost was more than the man could ever afford to pay. The aftermath of the storm left a profound silence over the city, but it was a silence born of peace rather than fear. Amara Johnson stood at the window of her mother's apartment, the morning sun warming her face and softening the faint, fading mark on her cheek. She was no longer the invisible shadow moving through the golden-lit aisles of a restaurant that didn't care for her. The red waitress vest had been folded away, replaced by a sense of security she hadn't felt since her parents were alive. She leaned against the frame, her eyes wide and glossy, not with the trauma of the slap, but with a quiet, overwhelming relief. Below, on the quiet street where the human wall had once stood, a single black sedan remained, a silent sentinel ensuring that the safety she now possessed was absolute. Park Sung-hoon sat in the back of that sedan, his sharp, hardened facial features finally relaxed into a state of somber reflection. His jaw was no longer clenched in explosive rage, and the lethal focus in his eyes had shifted toward a new, more complex purpose. He looked at the city he had once ruled through calculated violence and realized that his power had been a hollow thing until he used it to shield his only friend. His disciplined, high-status presence remained, but the ghost of soul was evolving. He had realized that a territory was worthless if the innocent could be struck down for a minor mistake, and his loyalty to Amara had rewritten the very code his organization lived by. The transformation of his empire began with the same surgical precision he had used to dismantle the rich customer. Sung-hoon mobilized his lieutenants, men who still commanded wealth, power, and danger, but their orders had changed. They were no longer just moving cargo and collecting debts. They were establishing a network of protection for those the city's elite had forgotten. From the back alleys to the service entrances of the grandest hotels, the word had spread. To harm a worker was to answer to the ghost personally. He had turned his criminal machine into a shield, an invisible wall that protected the petite and the vulnerable from the predatory arrogance of the powerful. Amara stepped away from the window as a knock sounded at her door. It wasn't a threat, but a delivery, a scholarship for her sister and a medical trust for her mother, sent without a name but bearing the unmistakable mark of a debt repaid. She looked toward the street and saw Sung-hoon step out of his car for a brief moment, his dark hair neatly styled and his black tailored coat shielding him from the wind. He didn't wave or shout, he simply looked up, his eyes locking with hers in a final, silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. It was a connection of mutual respect and emotional dependence that transcended the violence of their worlds. As the car pulled away, Amara realized she wasn't just safe, she was empowered. The community of service workers who had stood with her now moved with a different posture, their shoulders drawn in no longer with shame, but with the pride of people who were finally seen. Sung-hoon had proved that some lines could never be crossed, and in doing so, he had found his own humanity in the heart of the girl who hadn't turned away when he was the one in need. The war was over, but the new code of the city was just beginning, written in the absolute loyalty of a man who would burn down the world before he let his only friend feel unsafe again.